Hi, everyone. This is Ontero. Today, I have the privilege of talking with Marjorie Orellana. She's a professor at the Graduate School of Education at UCLA, as well as a mentor and advisor for me while I was a student at UCLA, both in the teacher education program, later as I pursued my doctorate. It's my pleasure to talk with you. Thanks, Marjorie.
Yeah.
Particularly around your recent book, Immigrant Children in Transcultural Spaces, Language, Learning, and Love. And maybe we could start there and just talk about that last word in the title, love. Why is that title? Why is that word in an academic book? Is it allowed to be there? What's the story there?
Well, I can't tell you how many people have said to me, I love that you have love in the title. And they say it with that sort of like little bit of transgressiveness, which there is. I mean, and I'm really following Bell Hooks, who says, I've just decided I'm going to talk about love wherever I go, even if it frightens and enrages people. And we might ask, why is the notion of love in relation to education, why does that feel so transgressive? But I think the fact that so many people have said that to me tells me, and they say that they're glad that they love that I have love in the title. That says to me something about the state of education today, that I do think we're reaching the end of this accountability era, measurement and defining and thinking that learning can be determined through these discrete measurements rather than something more from the heart and looking for engagement and animation. Actually, I distinguish, I think you noticed, animation from engagement, because I think they're two different things. And I'm looking for, where do we get animated? Where do kids get excited? And that's, what are the things they love? What do they love about learning? What do they love about the people they're learning with and for and connecting to each other and to the world? So that's why love is in the title of this book.
So I love that. You give me so much optimism when you talk about maybe the state of education today. I mean, I usually feel very browbeaten when I think about it. So thank you for that. I'm wondering, so you pointed to this for a moment ago. Could you talk a little bit about these differences between engagement and animation? And I'll say my thinking around this is I've always tended to use this word engagement, and maybe naively so as I dug into your book.
Yeah. Well, I too find myself using it, but I try to catch myself ever since I realized that engagement feels like something like cogs trying to catch on a wheel. You have to engage. You have to engage the engine of the car. You have to get it to work. And I think that is the way we talk about how are we going to engage kids in learning. Versus, to me, that feels very different than sparking animation. Seeing where kids, and in this I'm following my colleague Fred Erickson, saying follow kids to see where they light up. And what does that lighting up mean? We know it when we see it. We know when someone gets excited and animated and it comes from within. And then so can we notice that? Can we follow it? Can we support that kind of learning? And can we notice when people shut down, when the eyes sort of glaze over, when that animation from within is not happening? And sure, when that happens, we could try to engage them, animate instead.
I love that. And I think, so one of the places where you try to follow students and see these places where they light up is a club that you call B Club in the book. And there's probably a longer history there than our conversation has time for today. But what I really appreciate about where B Club is geographically situated in Los Angeles is it's a space that you point out you have this personal connection with over at least over 2 decades that you kind of talked about, as formally researching within that space. Could you talk about some of the changes you've seen in this language-rich space, to also quote another phrase from your book?
Yeah. Well, I moved out to California in 1983 and quite naively, so thought, oh, I can teach. There was a teaching shortage, emergency credentials. I got one. I began teaching in this densely populated new immigrant community. There were 2,700 kids in this one K-5 school. It was a multi-track year-round Concept 6 modified school. By that, It meant kids were in school for 2 months, off for 1. Many of the children were from families that were fleeing civil war in Central America. So that's one of the changes we see, and yet continuities in this community. It's always been a new immigrant community. The particular population of immigrants has changed over time, and it tends to be a community where people land briefly before moving out to other spaces. But right now, we're seeing a new influx of Central American immigrants, now more from Honduras. And during the 80s, it was more Salvadoran and Guatemalan, fleeing civil war then, the Honduras and Salvadorans again now. It's 30 years later. It's the legacy of the wars, or,
Sure.
civil strife that started long before that and that continues to this day, takes new form. But once again, we have families fleeing, and they're refugees, even if they're not called refugees in the legal sense of that term in the US.
So thinking about this kind of sustained flux, maybe of the population in Los Angeles, you kind of situate parts of, I'd say, the second half of your book, looking at different words that have this prefix trans, right? So transculturation, translanguaging, transliteracies, and you're very particular about why trans as a prefix there. Could you talk a little bit about what that means and maybe what it might look like?
Yeah. Well, I do think we are in a time in which this prefix trans is emerging in many spaces. And it's, for me, it's something about surpassing, going beyond, moving past the binaries and the divisions that have, finding a dialectical resolution to these long-standing tensions, and not just creating some new category of difference. So the transculturation is about moving beyond and creating something new, but it's the movement that I'm interested in, not what gets created that's new. And so we're in this time of tremendous movement of people around the world. Even in the community I'm working with, it's mostly Central American and Mexican immigrants, but there's also Korean, there's some from Somalia, there's some from the Philippines, and they're from different regions and towns and experiences even within Central America. So there, it's some kind of form of what some folks are referring to as super diversity, in that there's new and changing and dynamic flows of people who are meeting up and negotiating life and figuring out what it means. You mentioned the multilingual and the language-rich community, and you walk around this community, there are signs in Spanish, in English, in Korean, all kinds of signs, multimodal signs. This is a print-rich and multilingual rich environment that is alive for the taking. And I think if we start to see these things as resources, so all the cultural resources, all the linguistic and literate resources, and there too, seeing, instead of trying to engage kids with the literacies of school, let's start with the literacies of their community and their world.
I love that. And I think there's a moment when you're looking at a reflection from one of the you had a group of undergraduates and graduate students who are working with you in this B Club after school environment, right? Trying to give a little bit of context. And some of your undergrads looked at the community and really had a deficit lens when they were looking at it. And I think this is just, the stages of how we learn about spaces. And instead you were able to really flip it and say, look at this tremendously rich, wealthy space of language and of culture around the space and what that means and those kinds of implications. And that felt really helpful for me as an educator to think about.
It's definitely something we try to do in this work that's around B Club, which is this unique space bringing together undergraduates, now teacher education students, and kids, and researchers as well, with all of us being pushed to learn and to see in new ways, especially trying to see how the children see things and learn in completely fresh ways. The kids, again, whose families have come from places around the globe. So what a tremendous resource for all of us to learn to see the world in new ways. I think that starts with opening our minds and our hearts to see in new ways, and noticing when they shut down, when the walls start to go up. And one of the ways walls start to go up is when people say, oh, see, they don't know this, or they can't do this, or there isn't this. Every time we find ourselves framing things in the negative, we say, well, what is there? What are we missing? What can they do? What can we do? And what if we flip those scripts? What does that help us see that we might have missed when we started from that, from noticing gaps and noticing problems and noticing deficits? And which I do think
this gets me
tendency to notice what's wrong instead of what potential is there that could be built upon.
I mean, it's definitely a new way of looking, right? So, and I think this might be, challenges within schools of education as we prepare teachers. And I know this is something you've been working a lot with in terms of preparing new cohorts of teachers. How do you get them to see the possibilities in classrooms differently? How do you get them to see this movement, this maybe, as you were talking around transliteracies, for example, this emphasis more on process than on the product of what's made? Have you thought of any lessons in particular for pre-service or current in-service teachers around these lessons?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest lesson we try to work on at B Club, as we bring undergraduates, well, now pre-service teachers into the space, is precisely that notion of seeing what is happening, not what's not bringing assumptions to bear about what we think should happen, or what we think learning should look like, or what we think should do, and also shaking up their own role in that space to say, what does it really mean to be part of a community that we're developing together, rather than I know some way of taking up some kind of teacher voice. Because what if it's shaking it up and saying, how do we learn to see possibility and to see in new ways?
That's good.
Yeah, I think that's the and it's not easy, because we do bring long histories of experience with schools and learning and children, and I think people are often made uncomfortable when things don't happen the way they think it's what it's supposed to look like. And I think, or and this speaks to the issue of love as well. Like, I'm not trying to take a naive notion of love, like, oh, if teachers just love their children, everything will be fine. I think we have to look hard at what gets in the way of love and of real, genuine, and respectful and kind relations between people. One of the things that happens in schools is teachers are charged not just with loving children, but with getting them to do things, getting them to behave, to manage and control them. Words that I don't like, but teachers are judged. We all are judged by how well our students perform by the measures that schools expect. So that can set up this tension between and lead to tremendous frustration, and that gets in the way of the love.
I love that. My dog has been agreeing with you in the background here on my end. I think so much about you do such a clear job of positioning who you are as a person throughout the chapters of your book, and that kind of positionality as part of the responsibility of what we need to do as educators is really helpful. And you situating that here is also helpful for me. Maybe it's just one last final question, although it's a very random one, but maybe do you have a big wish for how people will read this book, or a wish kind of looking forward at 2016 and love and learning? Oh man, sorry, Olive is very excited about that question.
Yeah. Well, I guess my wish would be that people read it in the spirit that I tried to write it, with as open a heart and as open a mind as possible. I think it's easy to read it and say, oh, okay, but that's just an after-school program, or that can't happen in schools, or that's just her perspective. But what if we see the possibility? And I hope people will read and say, is there something I can take from this that sparks, animates the reader to say, what can I bring and do in the spaces that I'm working with? How can I see possibility instead of critique?
That's perfect. Well, thank you, Marjorie. I really appreciate your time. And so thanks for taking some time with me today.
Great. Enjoyed talking as always. Thanks, Santiago.
Thank you.